In every age, in every story, there is a place where heaven touches earth, where light bursts through the darkness, where chaos and death are defeated, and order and life spread forth in abundance. These are sacred spaces, castles and cathedrals, temples and thrones, altars and gardens, where life is reborn, souls are transformed, and kings are crowned with glory and honor.
I give you King Peter, the Magnificent.
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
One by one, the three lands of Middle-earth fell to the power of the ring.
As the child is. Without the rope.
Sword of truth lies swift and sure, that evil die and good endure.
You have nothing left but your death. the sacrifice. Now come the days of the king.
These stories and scenes mean something to us because they're true. Not necessarily in the sense that they all happened exactly as told, but because they reflect timeless and universal patterns at the heart of the human condition. They speak to something deep within us, activating the structures of the psyche that move the human spirit through pain and struggle towards meaning and redemption and transformation and renewal. These stories are the pattern of becoming, because within every man and woman lies the potential for kingship, waiting to be awakened, shaped, and crowned with power, honor, and glory. Now, this journey has always had a symbolic or ritualized expression. The progression of the soul is reflected in our sacred architecture around the world. The same patterns that shape the inner life and the journey of the soul are built into landscapes, cathedrals, monuments, castles, and temples. Kingship, life, death, heroes, battles, sacrifice, heaven and earth, God and Satan, all of these concepts converge in a single enduring concept: sacred space. Mircea Eliade, the preeminent historian of religion, defines sacred space as a rupture in the flatness of undifferentiated space, a place where the divine has broken through. The sacred is not just symbolic, it's an experience, a tangible encounter with a reality that transcends material explanation. Other scholars describe sacred space as the place where the transcendent becomes immanent, where the veil thins between God and man, and the boundary between flesh and spirit becomes transparent. In this sense, sacred space is more than a location. It's a bridge between worlds, heaven and earth. But how? How do crowns and castles, cathedrals, altars, plazas, temples, cemeteries, monuments, gardens, and basilicas, how do these earthly structures draw heaven and earth together? Do sacred spaces lift the soul? Do they impose order on chaos? Do they draw us into communion with something greater than ourselves? I wanted to find out. So I set out across Europe, a continent layered with sacred memory. And as I walked, I watched and listened. And slowly, patterns began to emerge, clues to how sacred space works and what it reveals about ourselves, the divine, and the space that lies between. To understand it, we must turn back to the very beginning, back to the prototype, the original sacred space, the archetype from which all others are drawn, the Garden of Eden. For this, we'll be referencing the book of Genesis. And according to Genesis, the human story begins in a garden encompassed by a wall where God and man walked together. It was paradise. The word paradise comes from the ancient Persian Pyradasia, literally meaning a walled enclosure. Eden is the first sanctuary, a space set apart and dedicated to the flourishing of life. It's lush and fertile. Green meadows, clear blue fountains, cold streams, towering shade trees, and all manner of fruit and herbs. Joyful animals roam freely through the pastures. Songbirds whistle their tunes. Fish glide through crisp waters. And in the midst of it all stands man, placed as creation's lawful sovereign, given dominion by God to cultivate, to tend, and to protect the garden's sanctuary. He is charged with preserving and expanding the abundance of life. This is the first king ruling and reigning over the first kingdom, the archetype of the castle and the palace with its royal gardens. It's perfect harmony. Every part is in its place, every voice and tune playing the music of life as it was meant to be. And in the most sacred center of Eden, where the north and south and the east and west lines cross, is the crown jewel, the tree of life. Its radiant, pure white fruit bestows the powers of immortality and eternal life to those who partake. Its leaves shine with blazing, pure white light. It's glorious, brilliant, and terrifying all at the same time. This tree is a symbol of the source of life itself. It is the throne of God. Its placement is as significant as its radiance. The tree stands at the precise point where the north-south and the east-west lines cross, and where the vertical and the horizontal, heaven and earth, intersect. The word temple is tied to the root tem from Greek, meaning to cut. So the temple is the place where the great lines of orientation intersect, north, south, east, and west, as well as where the vertical, heaven and earth, horizontal intersect, forming the four corners of the earth and the axis of the world. So the tree or the throne in the center is the heart of a sort of temple, where the lines cut or cross, marking the center. As we might say, X marks the spot. But the root tem, to cut, is also informative because the temple is a space cut off or divided from the outside, profane and fallen world. But from this sacred center, the tree, from beneath it, beneath the throne, we read of four rivers springing forth, each flowing in a different direction at right angles to water the entire earth. These are fountains of living water originating from beneath the tree, from beneath the heart of the garden. They sustain and give rise to all life across the face of the world, flowing outward from the sacred center. God says in the Old Testament that it is good. The word good comes from the ancient root ged, meaning to unite, to bring together, and to join. It's the same root where we get the word gather and together. So to be good is to be gathered, joined and united. The sacred center is where all things come together. Eden is harmony. Harmony comes from the ancient root ar, which also means to join together. From that ar root, we also get the words art and articulate, architect, carpenter, and arrangement. An artist and an architect, then, are people who arrange things in order, those who join things together. They articulate an idea. And the tools of the architect carry symbolic weight, as some may recognize. So anyways, Eden is harmonious and good. It's joined together and united. Even the word atonement echoes this idea, literally meaning at one-ment, to join together and to unify. The image we are given then is of an encircled, walled sanctuary, abundant with life, and tended to by a king. And at its center stands the divine tree, the axis of life, the throne of God, from which all vitality flows. A divine king ruling in his garden kingdom. The word divine, for what it's worth, comes from the ancient root dieu, which means to shine. It's the same root that gives us the word day. Outside of Eden lies the profane world, a realm of thistles and thorns, blood and toil, death and decay, fear and scarcity, division and violence. This is profane space. The word profane comes from the Latin profanus, literally meaning outside the temple. By contrast, Eden is the first temple, the holy sanctuary where God descended to dwell with man, where he walked with Adam in the cool of the day. What we see here is a tripartite division. First, at the sacred center, where the divine presence dwells. Second, encompassing it, is the land of Eden, the garden with a wall. And outside the wall is the third space, the dark and dreary world. This is similar to Dante's Divine Comedy, where he divides it into three parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. The deeper you move towards the center, the more sacred the space becomes. And what makes it sacred is presence, the presence of God, of light, and of life. This is the archetype, the blueprint for temples, castles, cathedrals, kingdoms, paradise, and heaven. It's the pattern of the cosmos. But as you know, Eden was lost. The fall of man recorded in Genesis was when man walked away from Eden, from heaven in unity and abundance of life. Paradise and presence were replaced with pain and privation. We lost access to the tree of life. Angels with flaming swords, as recorded in Genesis, were placed to guard the entrance back into Eden and block re-entry through the wall. Note that the word garden and guardian come from the same root, gird, which means to enclose. So a garden is something that is guarded. So after this fall, God no longer walked with man. Death and decay took over. Separation seeped into everything. Between man and God, man and nature, man and woman, even between atoms, as now all things tend toward entropy and decay. To leave Eden is to leave the source of life, the power that brings things together. And ever since then, man has longed to return back to the sacred center, to live forever, to recover what was lost. Paradise, harmony, and heaven. This ache, this longing for Eden haunts every age and every conscious soul. He longs to drink again from the living water, to eat from the tree of life, to be clothed in glory and dwell in the presence of God. It is this longing that drives us to build sacred spaces, not as mere symbols of what was lost, but as acts of remembrance and transformation. In carving out our temples and altars and sanctuaries, gardens and cathedrals, we are attempting to reharmonize the world, to rejoin what has been torn, and to draw heaven and earth back together, and to restore ourselves and the land to the paradise that once was. My journey to understand sacred space began in Italy, the heart of the Catholic Church and the former seat of the Roman Empire. The Romans weren't Christian at first, but they still built temples, altars, and sacred spaces. And it wasn't just them. Every ancient civilization had its own version of sacred space. They didn't all tell the Garden of Eden story, but they all seemed to know that some spaces are set apart, cut off, and charged with meaning and touched by the divine. So sacred space isn't just Christian, it's a human concept. I started in the ancient cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which were destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius around 79 AD. And ironically, the ash did a remarkable job at preserving the city. The Roman homes and estates here were frequently built around a central courtyard, often with a garden. And at its heart, in the middle of the courtyard or garden, was a tree or a fountain, a design which should look familiar. Even in domestic space, we see the impulse to recreate a kind of paradise, enclosed, ordered, and in the center, some type of life-giving form, such as a tree or a fountain, exactly like Eden. I saw this same motif in front of the Pantheon, an ancient Roman temple. There in front, an upright obelisk rises like a tree trunk, with water flowing from its base, evoking the image of the tree of life in Eden with rivers springing forth beneath it. A similar design appears in the center of the Vatican Plaza, encircled by the round colonnade, which its designer Bernini called the maternal arms of the church, is a towering obelisk at the very center, acting as a cosmic axis, a pillar connecting heaven and earth, and a solid anchor point to stabilize the chaotic world. And on top of the obelisk is the cross, which the early Christians called a tree of life. In the Borghese Gardens, I found it again. Circular clearings paved in stone, each with an upright fountain at the center. Also in the Borghese Gardens, in the center of another clearing, was a monopteros, a type of round colonnade. In antiquity, these were commonly built over a life source, sacred springs or wells, or over the statue of a hero or god figure. On top of this one was a pine cone, another symbol of life and regeneration, which I also saw in the Louvre in Paris in the Mesopotamia section, where it bears the same meaning. Also in Rome is the famous Trevi Fountain. In this magnificent public work, we see waters flowing out from underneath the Poli Palace, which cascades into the fountain. This pattern is the same. The kingly royal center, in this case it's the palace, and out from under its base springs forth streams of water, like the rivers of Eden. This same image is spoken in the words of the prophets Joel and Ezekiel, seeing a vision of the future temple.
And it shall come to pass in that day, a fountain shall come forth of the house of the Lord, and shall water the valley of Shittim. Joel 3. Afterward he brought me again unto the door of the house, and behold, waters issued out from under the threshold of the house. Ezekiel 47.
Joel and Ezekiel are describing the same image, a fountain issuing from the house of the Lord, watering the surrounding land. This reminds me of how many European plazas are built around a central fountain. These public squares, sites of gathering, still retain the same spatial logic. I also noticed that on the floor of the Siena Cathedral in Italy, in the center of the nave, is a marble inlay of the medieval Wheel of Fortune. The outer ring turns endlessly, its figures rising and falling, symbolizing the inconstancy and fleeting nature of this world. Yet at the heart of the wheel is a golden center, steadfast and unmoving. It doesn't turn, it remains, anchored, eternal, the firm point in a world of flux. Interestingly, the word firm comes from the same ancient root that gives us the word throne, making throne and firm etymological siblings. So the golden center in the Wheel of Fortune is the firm point, the throne of God, the anchored point around which the world turns. Next was the Royal Palace of Versailles in France, famous for its grand halls and gardens. This palace is where the king lived, so we get the same association of kings and gardens like we saw in the Genesis account of Eden. The gardens are a recreation of the Eden paradise watched over by their king Adam, just as the French king Louis tended over his gardens. And I observed that in the center of each garden region is always a fountain, springing up with water, the source of life, reminding us again that true vitality flows outward from the throne, the center, the sacred source. In England, I visited Stonehenge, another sacred space bearing the same pattern, a walled circular enclosure set apart from the surrounding land, and at its center a massive rock known as the altar stone. Its position at the center of the circle makes the center the place of sacrifice and divine presence. This looked remarkably similar to the American D-Day Memorial in France that I visited, called the Garden of the Missing. Here we have yet another paradisiacal garden with a centered source of water standing in front of a walled circular colonnade. And in the center of the circle is an upright statue titled American Youth Rising from the Waves. So the place of these soldiers' sacrifice is also the place of their ascension or exaltation. Exaltation means to be lifted up. This is a powerful idea we'll visit later. The same layout was seen in Trafalgar Square. Here in the central gathering place of London, there's this tall pillar, and at its base, fountains gush waters in each direction. We see the same symbolic arrangement in front of the Royal Buckingham Palace. At the center stands an upright pedestal bearing the figure of Queen Victoria on her throne, and above her the goddess Nike. Flowing out from beneath this axis are fountains of water, an image that once again evokes life issuing from the center and the seat of royal authority. This pattern is also seen in the cloister of the Basilica di Santa Maria Novella, along with many others. In this we see a walled garden with an upright structure in the center where the four lines intersect. This time, like in Stonehenge, it's an altar in the center, a type of connection point between heaven and earth. Significantly, the word altar comes from the Latin altus, which means high up or elevated, which is also where we get the word altitude and exalted. So the altar, or the elevated place, is the place of sacrifice, but also the place of lifting up, which is why altars are always placed in a place of altitude, such as an Aztec altar on top of a pyramid, an altar on top of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, an altar on the raised platform in a church, Abraham's altar on top of Mount Moriah, and Christ's cross as a type of altar on top of Mount Calvary. This same pattern appears in less noteworthy places, such as this garden park in England, where we see the fountain at the center, or in another garden park, an erect stone pillar in the center of this circular paved clearing. These layouts mirror the familiar pattern, the sacred center marked by stone, tree, water, an anchor, or an altar, a place of vertical ascent. The central stone or fountain pattern is also apparent in the ancient Hebrew Temple of Solomon. In the center of the temple, in the most holy place, was the foundation stone. And according to tradition, underneath the stone was Tehom, the chaotic water of the abyss or underworld. According to their records, the world began from this single stone, called the Ebenah Shetiyah. It was seen as the spot where heaven touched earth and where the underworld below was sealed, and where the divine order was firmly anchored. I also had the chance to visit two castles, the Tower of London and the Edinburgh Castle. These are reconstructions of the same idea, a protected walled enclosure with a throne or crown jewels in the center. In the center of the ancient Israelite temple, their walled enclosure, was the Ark of the Covenant. This was seen as the throne of God, the King of Kings. This image associates the seat of kingly authority with the temple. The temple is the throne room, just like the two castles that I visited. The gemstones and crown jewels in a castle are also significant in relation to the Genesis account of Eden. We read from Genesis 2 that in the land around Eden were precious stones, gold, onyx, and bdellium, associating precious stones with the sacred center, the walled enclosure, and kingship. And in the book of Revelation, God himself is also symbolized by precious stones. John sees a vision of heaven and says,
"A throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he that sat was to look upon like a jasper and a sardius stone. And there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald. And round about the throne I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold."
So a king on a throne in a castle, wearing a gold crown decorated in gemstones, is all part of the visual language of the sacred space in Genesis. Even the priests of the Old Testament, the ones authorized to enter the sacred temple enclosure, wore a special breastplate covered in gemstones. All of this hints that the priest or king in the midst of the walled temple or castle is redonning the original glory and dominion of the first king and kingdom, Adam and his garden. His calling was to tend the garden, to preserve its harmony and sustain the divine order, like a good king would do. He was the first regal ruler, reigning over a region as a righteous regent, regulating and directing what was correct and right. He was even given the first royal regalia by God after being cast out of the garden. Tons of linguistic connections here. All of those words originate from the Proto-Indo-European root reg, meaning to straighten, or to guide, or to rule. In this etymology, to rule and to be righteous are fundamentally the same act, to set things in order, to align the world with what is true and correct. In Latin, the word rex means king, also drawn from the same root, suggesting that kingship itself was understood as the embodiment of rightness. Also mentionable is that sinister in Latin means left. The king then was not merely a political figure, but a regent of God, a sacred architect. Remember, the root means one who joins together. He was one who orders the profane into sacred space with the tools of creation, or the tools of carpentry, creating harmony. The right angle of the carpenter's square and the encircling compass become the symbols of this divine task. It casts new light on the gospel's quiet but profound detail that Jesus of Nazareth was a carpenter. Now, moving outward from the sacred center, from the divine presence, the throne, the firm point, the tree of life, the fountain, the altar, the elevated place, moving out from this, there's almost always an encircling boundary or a circumference, a wall, a veil, or a partition. This threshold separates the sacred from the profane. And at this boundary, there's often a guardian in front of the garden. Remember, the words come from the same root. In Eden, it was the cherubim with flaming swords, but often it's lions or sphinxes, figures that protect and signify the passage from one realm to another. They mark the crossing into sacred space, a space that must be approached with reverence and readiness. Only the worthy and the pure can pass and enter. For instance, to reach St. Peter's Basilica, the center of the Catholic Church, you must first pass through a narrow gate in a towering wall, a wall constructed to protect the original basilica built by Constantine. And through that wall is another sort of wall, the round colonnade encircling and enclosing the pillar in the very middle of the plaza, in the sacred center. Likewise, there's a walled entrance to the Borghese Gardens, and two statues stand as sentinels, guardians before the garden, the enclosed space. And at the base of this pillar in Westminster in England were these two lions, guarding the tree or pillar between them. I also saw the same thing at the base of this obelisk in Paris, but this time two sphinxes guard the upright pillar. And at the Tower of London, the entire royal castle complex is enclosed and surrounded by a massive stone wall, with a fortified gate that must be passed through, another threshold marking the transition from the common world into the holier realm. This was also seen in the Edinburgh Castle, where statues of two legendary warriors, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, guard the gate that leads through the wall into the kingly sacred realm inside. It's the same archetypal threshold where the sacred must be protected and only the prepared may pass. But what about cathedrals? There are generally no guards at the gate, no sentinels flanking the entrance. The threshold isn't marked by cherubim with flaming swords, but instead you find something more subtle, a simple basin of water. As worshippers enter, they pause, they dip their fingers into the holy water, and trace the sign of the cross upon their bodies. This act is the passage. It is the purification before entry that must take place to re-enter the sacred space as a worthy initiate. And although much less common now, in ages past, cathedrals almost always had a sort of veil or a wall in front of the high altar, which would bar it from the common worshippers in the congregation. The altar hosts the Eucharist, the bread and wine, which contain the actual presence of God. And so this wall would section off the rest of the group from the place where God dwells on the altar. This wall goes by many names. Sometimes it's called the altar rail or the chancel rail or the templon or the rood screen or the iconostasis. The basic idea was that the sanctuary behind it was an immensely sacred space and thus cut off from the commoners. Remember the root tem, where we get the word temple, means to cut. So only the priest was allowed to pass through the templon, or the iconostasis, and enter the sanctuary where the altar resides. And on the iconostasis were depictions of saints and angels, who functionally stood as guardians in front of the guarded enclosure, where the altar resides, only permitting the worthy to enter. This is reminiscent of the veil in Moses' tabernacle and in Solomon's temple in the Old Testament. Upon these veils, which stood in front of the most holy place, were embroidered cherubim. These angelic figures were the guardians in front of the sacred center and had to be passed by in order to reach the throne or the dwelling place of God, which was the Ark of the Covenant. This is exactly like the saints and angels on the iconostasis, standing in front of the high altar where God's presence dwells in a cathedral. I also noticed in a number of basilicas and cathedrals, several of these canopy structures erected above the main altar. Most famously, the grand bronze one in St. Peter's Basilica crafted by Bernini. These are sometimes called a baldachin or a ciborium, and in earlier times, they were always veiled with curtains that could be drawn around all four sides, enclosing off the altar in the middle. These curtains served a symbolic function by marking off the altar as an especially sacred place, Again, much like the curtain in Solomon's temple that concealed the Ark of the Covenant or the throne of God, or the walled enclosed Garden of Eden. Interestingly, the word curtain comes from the root we mentioned earlier, gird, which means to enclose, which gives us the words garden and guardian. So even in its etymology, the curtain isn't just a piece of fabric. It's a boundary guarding what is most holy from the unworthy and unclean. It's this archetype where we get ideas like the sword and the stone, or Thor's hammer Mjolnir, or in Norse myth, the legendary sword of Sigmund in the Barnstoker tree in the center of King Volsung's hall. In these stories, only the worthy and the prepared can wield the divine power obtained from the sacred center. The tent-like canopy structure of the baldachin or the ciborium also relates back to Moses' tabernacle, the word tabernacle meaning tent or canopy. This was the, quote, tent of meeting, where God's presence could descend and dwell. And you get this same exact image in the ceiling of Bernini's tent-like baldacchino in St. Peter's. Carved in the ceiling is the sign of the Holy Spirit, the dove, descending in blazing light. But the ciborium or the baldachin were not only used to stand above and cover an altar or relic, as we see in cathedrals and basilicas. Before they marked the place of divine presence in Christian worship, they were used to cover earthly rulers, kings, emperors, and their thrones. In Rome, Persia, and Byzantium, richly embroidered canopies were suspended above the sovereign seat, visually setting the ruler apart as separated, elevated, and quasi-divine. The baldachin thus served as a symbol of sacred kingship, designating the throne, ruler, or altar as the central point from which order radiated. In Herculaneum, I saw a mini version of the ciborium called an aedicule, preserved from 2,000 years ago. The canopy-shaped aedicule functioned as a miniature temple for a sacred statue, relic, or image. In a cathedral, the entire space in the back around the holy altar is called the chancel. The word chancel means lattice or grating, and it referred originally to the screen or barrier, such as the templon or the iconostasis, that separated the holy altar from the rest of the church where the congregation sat. This same sort of barrier, again called a templon, was also used on occasions to separate the Roman emperors from the public when they appeared in ceremonial settings. This gives us a powerful connection between rulership, sacredness, and separation. Just as the altar is veiled from the congregation, the emperor is set apart from the people. At this point, it's worth commenting on the entire floor plan of the standard Latin cross cathedral and basilica. In this layout is seen the same tripartite division discussed earlier. In the cathedral is the narthex, nave, and altar, roughly corresponding to the world, Eden, and the tree of life in Genesis. As one progresses towards the altar in the cathedral, they are reenacting the approach towards the tree of life or the throne of God. Most cathedrals are oriented with the entrance on the west and the altar on the east, which places the altar at the location of the rising sun. In Latin, east is oriens, coming from the verb orior, which means to rise. This is where we get the word orient, orientation, and origin. To face east is to be oriented towards the origin. This was symbolic of the resurrection and rising, orior, of the body of Christ. St. Peter's Basilica is an exception to this general pattern because the altar is on the west side. In this layout, worshippers approach the altar by moving westward towards the setting sun. Occidens is the Latin word for west, coming from the verb occidere, which means to fall or to die, which also gives us the English word decay. So worshippers approach the decaying, dying sun to reach the holy place. This would seem to symbolize to the worshipper that the way of approach is the way of death, death of the self and its carnal and fallen nature, as is symbolized in baptism by immersion. By following Christ westward into the direction of death, the worshipper not only mirrors his death, but through that, his resurrection. As Paul says in Romans 6,
"We were buried therefore with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life." For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his.
It also creates this really neat effect that I captured on camera, where the rising sun shines through the eastern windows towards the altar. This westward layout is shared by Solomon's temple and Moses' tabernacle. This is significant because when Adam and Eve were banished from the garden, according to Genesis, it was to the east. So in order to return to Eden and to the tree of life, a person must retrace Adam and Eve's departure by traveling west. I also noticed that in all cathedrals and basilicas were towering vaulted ceilings, radiant colors of stained glass, light streaming through high windows, soaring domes, polished marble floors, frescoed walls, and glittering mosaics. All of these contribute to intentionally generate a certain feeling in a person, a deep longing or an ache for the transcendent heavenly world. Sacred spaces then call our attention upward toward order, symmetry, light, and harmony in heaven through their very design elements. The sacred is understood to be the presence of the divine. Remember, the word divine comes from the root meaning to shine. The sacred is light. It's the presence of God. But what exactly makes a place sacred? What draws in the light of God? The altar, stone, tree, crown, or throne in the center marks the sacred intersection between heaven and earth. But what makes the altar or stone or tree sacred? How does it receive and contain the divine light? The answer is sacrifice. Sacrifice makes things sacred. The word sacrifice itself comes from Latin sacere and facere, which put together means to make sacred. To sacrifice is to sacrify something. For example, in a basilica or cathedral, the sacredness of the space generally stems from two primary sources: the presence of the Eucharist, the bread and wine on the altar, or the enshrinement of a sacred relic within or under the church. The Eucharist on the altar makes present again the sacrifice of Christ, who offered his life for the church. This makes the space sacred. And the relic in or under the altar represents the sacrifice of a saint, someone who offered their life in witness to Christ, often through martyrdom. Many cathedrals are often built on top of their bones or tomb. Again, their sacrifice makes the space sacred. In order to receive light or the divine, to draw it down, things must be given up, sacrificed. Man offers flesh and God offers fire. The mortal gives what is his: blood, life, bread, incense, and in return, God descends, often symbolized by fire, glory, or light. A space is made sacred where something dies. The death of Christ, the death of a martyr, the death of a saint, or the death of a soldier. In fact, this is what the word bless literally means. Bless comes from the same root as the word blood. And in Old English, to bless something meant to make it sacred by shedding blood. And what's always the sacred object in the sacred center? It's an altar, the place of sacrifice, where flesh is killed and burned, as if it were the offerer himself. This burning produces light, and down underneath the altar, martyrs' bones are buried. Or in the center is a tree of life, which offers its fruit, the olive, to be crushed and burned to produce light. Only through this breaking does it yield the oil that fuels the lamp. And as the psychoanalyst Carl Jung says, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell, to death. Or in the center is a well or fountain, and water only rises when the ground is pierced, when the earth is wounded, when one digs deep into the depths below. Or in the center is a stone. The stone is buried in the ground and placed on the underworld below. Or in Christianity, it's the cross, which is always depicted on the center altar in a cathedral. The cross is the place of sacrifice and death, where his blood runs down. And in Dante's Divine Comedy, he only reaches heaven by going down through the inferno first. It is through descent, death, burning, through going down, that life is lifted up. The death on and beneath the altar raises it. Remember, the altar means elevated place. The tree's roots descend into hell, yet nourish the tree to grow upward. The hole dug deep in the earth bursts forth with water. The stone rests in the underworld, but also firmly anchors the world above. Christ dies and is buried, but then rises and ascends to heaven. As Viktor Frankl said, What is to give light must endure burning. This was the answer to my question that I originally set out to answer. How do sacred spaces draw heaven and earth together? How do they invite us to respond? How do they redeem the fallen world, this world of decay, chaos, corruption, and death? And the answer is through death. The death of anything that is corruptible, selfish, disorderly, and bound to the lower nature of man, so that what is eternal, selfless, and divine may emerge in its place. It's all encapsulated in the symbol of the evil serpent on the cross. Another motif I noticed in a number of places around Europe. This symbol traditionally signifies healing and is even seen today on our ambulances. It likely goes all the way back to when Moses lifted up the brazen serpent in the wilderness to heal his people. This is likely why Christ in the New Testament says that he is the serpent on the cross. The serpent is the symbol of chaos, disorder, and sin, and Christ took upon himself the sin of the world. Or as Paul says, he became the curse. He became sin. He became the serpent. And his death on the cross becomes the death of the serpent. What died with him was the burden of the fallen world. And what rose with him was a new creation, healed and made holy. This is the pattern that sacred space teaches us. Heaven and earth are brought together through sacrifice, through death and descent. But what fallen and corruptible thing is to be sacrificed? The answer is the self. And sacrificed for others, just as Christ sacrificed himself for others. As he said, quote, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." And Paul urges us to do the same. Quote, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, so that, quote, the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies." Christ teaches plainly, "Whosoever loses their life will find it." So you can either lift yourself at the cost of others, or others can be lifted to your cost. So how do sacred spaces bridge the gap between heaven and earth? By recreating paradise through greenery, beauty, light, color, harmony, and symmetry, creating a longing for harmony that we have lost. They bridge the gap by teaching us about heaven through their architecture, walls, gardens, gates, veils, curtains, and gardens, and by teaching us how to approach heaven by being washed and worthy to pass by the guardians and enter through the wall. And sacred spaces bridge the gap by teaching us how to restore the garden paradise. This is done by becoming the sacred center, becoming the tree of life to nourish the earth, or the fountain of waters to water the earth, or the stone or pillar to anchor the earth, or the altar to sanctify the earth. Yet each one of these sacred centers functions only insofar as it goes down into the ground. The tree must root deep in the soil. The fountain must be drawn from the depths. The stone must be buried deep in the underworld to anchor the world above, and the altar must be stained with blood and placed on top of the bones of martyrs. Because in your descent, something else is lifted. And this is what love truly is. Sacrifice. To love is to pour yourself out for another, to lay down your own will, your own life, so that another might be healed, gathered, or made whole. Love always lowers itself, and in doing so, it raises everything around it. In the beginning, Eden was a place of unity, of harmony, of wholeness, a sacred center where all things were gathered. It was good, because what is good is what draws things together. Those words coming from the same root. But the world fell into separation and death. And sacred space is the pattern by which life and unity are restored. And sacrificial love, lowering oneself, is the power that makes it possible. It is this love that bridges the divide, reunites what was lost, orders the chaos, brings the dead back to life, and makes the world whole again. Cool. All right. Cut.